Well, that was quite an introduction. Thank you very much, Shad. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the Image Source people, and particularly Terry, for the invitation to be here, and also for hosting such a classy meeting. I do an awful lot of these kinds of presentations, as you probably could imagine, and this is definitely amongst the classiest that are around, and so I do appreciate the invite. I also just wanted to acknowledge Christina and Debbie and Shad for their personal commitment to social media and social technologies. I'll talk a little bit in a second as to why I think that's so important, but there are too few people out there that are committed to the social space in the same way that some of the folks from Image Source are, and so I really do appreciate that. By way of introduction, this is where I live, where that little A is, right there. More specifically, I live right next to Dulles Airport in the Washington, D.C. area. That's important because I spend a good amount of my time in this kind of an office on an airplane someplace. And more specifically, this is exactly where I live. If you look very closely, you can see the luxuriant nonprofit lifestyle reflected in the Saturn in the driveway there. As well as the landed estate that I live on there, which is about, I think, 0.15 of an acre. I feel very much at home here in the state of Washington because in terms of per capita Starbucks presence, you all are second only to where I come from in the Washington, D.C. area. And I gotta tell you, I tried that Tully's place today. That's an awesome place, too. We gotta get some of those in the Washington, D.C. area. So. Feel very, very comfortable here. These are my kids and my daughter-in-law. They would kill me if they knew I was showing this picture. My wife has banned all use of her images in any presentations that I make. She does know that I have a rather significant infatuation with Amy Adams, though, so I have included her in my little introduction. This is our deadly cat, Snickers. I won't really talk too much about that. And this is where you can find me. As Shad said, I'm not at John Mancini 77, it's J Mancini 77 on Twitter. That's usually where I can be found just about anywhere. My blog is called Digital Landfill. We take a lot of the components in the blog that are under the theme of 8 things and publish those as ebooks. And so those are free, they're under Creative Commons. You can use those for whatever purposes you choose, and so feel free. As Shad said, one of the byproducts and one of the benefits of social networking is that you do tend to push your rankings up in Google. So if you go to Google and do Digital Landfill, you will find my blog kind of number 1 or number 2. I also was a little disturbed to find this blog listed as like number 5 or number 6 the last time I looked. And it has come to my attention that girls and I do not mix well. What's with that? Am I disgusting or something? So if you get this Digital Landfill, this ain't me. This is the one that's me, and just pass over this one and kind of move on from there. As Shad said, I work for AIM, which is the Association for Information and Image Management. You know, a lot of people don't realize it, but AIM got its start over 60 years ago as the National Microfilm Association. A lot of people come to me and they say, geez, content management, microfilm, John, what the heck is that all about? And what it's all about is that as an organization, we have always been about the management of unstructured information in the context of business and organizational processes. And so the technologies change, and the technologies will continue to change, but that's been the connecting tissue that basically represents a community that's been around for more than 60 years, and pretty excited to be a part of it. I've been at AIM for about 15 years now, so I have a little bit of perspective on some of the changes that have gone on in this space and some of the changes that will continue to occur over the course of the next few years. I wanted to highlight 3 things for you, just in terms of things that you can get out of AIM, mostly for free, just so you can use these back in your organization. We do market research. We do fairly similar kinds of things to Gartner and to IDC and to Forrester. There's 2 main differences. One is that we don't do things like quadrants and waves and market sizing and things like that. We prefer to focus on user issues associated with the adoption and use of the technologies in our space. So if you are an end user and you're looking to benchmark what you do against other organizations, these research studies that we do about one every 2 months are a very good place to go to and to find information on and to use in your own organization. And they're at aim.org/research. They're all free, which is the other difference that we have between Gartner and Forrester and IDC. So please feel free to use them and distribute them in whatever way you choose. Second thing I wanted to leave you with is that we are the community of people in this space. So if you go to either aim.org or you go to our more community-specific site, aimcommunities.org, you'll find a series of communities that basically focus on how people use the technology, how they experience the technology, places where they can ask questions of experts about the technology. And the thing that you ought to know about membership, which is also a rather odd business model, is that basic membership is free. All you need to do is sign up. Professional membership is $125. And if you're not a member, we would really like to have you in either capacity, because I think it's really important to be part of this community on an ongoing basis. The last thing I just wanted to highlight in the realm of commercials is that we are the largest provider of training in this space in the world. We do it in 6. You can see the disciplines around the little pinwheel here. We've just recently added a 7th discipline in the SharePoint arena. We had a pre-con yesterday. Is Pam Doyle in here by any chance? Where's Pam? Stand up a minute. Pam did our pre-con yesterday. Pam has probably trained more people than anybody in the country with regards to content management technology. And she's one of the real gems of evangelism in this industry. So please give Pam a round of applause. And thank you guys for participating in the training yesterday. Any information that you want on training, aim.org training, I will tell you that in order to save marketing cost, if you're interested in our training, which we can do either online, we can do it in public courses, we can do it in private courses for buying teams or implementation teams. If you're interested in this, send me an email directly. Tell me you were at the Nexus event, and I'll make sure that they cut you a really good deal along the way, because you can curtail a lot of my marketing cost in the process. So what I would like to talk to you today, it's a little challenging, because what I want to do is to challenge you to think beyond what we can experience right now. And it's really reflected in this cartoon. If you look at the caption, never ever think outside the box. We have a tendency sometimes, when you are successful in a space, to not want to think outside the box. And that's why I think some of the things that Christina and Debbie and Shad are doing are so interesting, because I think they are pushing the envelope in terms of what this space means and how we communicate about this space. And I'd like to urge you to think in those terms as I go through a little exercise that we went through with a group of some of our companies over the course of the last 3 months, and share with you some of that information in terms of future directions of the industry. So the little effort that I'd like to talk to you about basically focuses on markets in transition. And for those of you that don't recognize the picture is of a chasm. And if you Google chasm, you will find this gentleman, Jeff Moore, who wrote basically the definitive text on this about 20 years ago. 25 years ago. And what he focuses on is what happens to technologies along the way of adoption and implementation. And what does it take for technologies to move from being just a light bulb in somebody's head that a few people adopt to being a mainstream technology that is really prevalent in most any organization that you might look at around the country or around the world. So at the board of directors level at AIM, we came to the conclusion about the beginning of this year that this industry is at one of those inflection points. And I got to tell you, it feels an awful lot like the inflection point when I first came on board at AIM 15 years ago. It feels like we are in the process of about to be radically transformed. And yet at the same time, we all have businesses to run. We all have projects that we have to implement. And so it's a challenging thing to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time, both thinking about how we tap into what we currently have and exploit the opportunities that we currently have, while simultaneously we prepare for the next round that I think is queuing up that's going to influence the shape of this industry moving forward. And so that's why I wanted you to really think in terms, again, of thinking outside the box as you start to think about those projects. That doesn't mean that you move away from the day-to-day implementation challenges that you have. But it does mean that you have to start thinking about that in terms of some of the changes that are going to sweep through the industry. So the task force that we had, that basically to explore these things, was these 9 companies. More information you can find on it at aim.org/futurehistory. And it's basically the story that the companies developed working with Jeff that I wanted to spend some time talking with you about today and talk a little bit about what the lessons are from that, what the vision is, how we see the industry moving forward, and what that means maybe in terms of some suggestions to think about in terms of how you shape your business requirements moving forward. So if you don't know Jeff's shtick, it's basically this bell curve. And basically what the shtick is that as you think about technologies and as they come to market, they come on that far, my right, your left side of the curve, that little blue space where innovators touch technologies. That's what the industry felt like 15 years ago when I first came to AIM. And in that environment, basically the buyer tended to be a very visional, functional executive. You know, what that buyer was looking for was essentially dramatic competitive advantage over his competitors. And the pricing of the technology at that point tended to be value-based, and it was not really so much focused on price. It was focused on what you could achieve with the technology. What happens, according to Jeff, and I think we've seen it in our industry, and I wanted to tell this story to you, is that we've essentially moved across the chasm into the majority phase of this industry. Now, there's a couple characteristics about the majority phase that are really interesting to think about, which is that, first of all, the buyer tends to be very pragmatist, technical kind of buyer. The buyer tends to be looking at this buy as an infrastructure decision, and the pricing decision tends to be very competitive. That's not a bad thing for mainstream end users. You know, right now you can get more technology in this space than you have ever been able to get at a cheaper price point, at price points that we couldn't even imagined 15 years ago. And that's really exciting. And that green space is where all the money is. But you don't get to the green space unless you cross across that chasm in the first place, and that's Jeff's argument. Our argument, as we looked at this on the task force, is that there is a new space that's emerging on that blue side that's complementary, in some ways contradictory to the existing space. But I think what we'd like to explore is some of the leverage points and connection points between it. And the space that's coming up is this whole social space and the revolutionary impact, I think, on what that's going to mean in terms of content management moving forward. So the 3 things that I wanted to do for you today and share with you are some thoughts on basically a short history of how we got where we are right now. Secondly, talk about the consumer space and how consumer expectations are going to bleed over into the enterprise space in terms of what we expect out of our enterprise systems. And then lastly, paint a picture, a future history of ECM as you start to think about what this industry will look like and how it will change over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. So when you think about this, when you think about the history of ECM, when you think about what this industry felt like when I first joined AIM 15 years ago, here's a couple of things that occurred to me along the way of what this felt like 15 years ago. The first thing is that solutions were expensive and they were complicated. Secondly, adoption was driven by the business. That's very different than now. Now adoption tends to be more driven by the IT people in organizations. Use case, not ROI, was critical. When I first came to AIM, nobody was talking about ROI. And that's a characteristic of a technology that's on the very, very early stages of implementation. At that point, people don't even know what ROI is. What they're looking for is dramatically different competitive advantage. And they don't care about ROI. They want to have a picture painted for them about what the use case is for all of this. In mainstream markets like we are now, ROI is critical because it's a price-based market. But that wasn't the case when I first came to AIM. When I first came, ease of use didn't matter. These systems were hard to use, but that really didn't matter because typically only, say, 5% of the people in our organizations were even using them. And they tended to be document specialists in large organizations that were working in departments. And that's what this industry was all about, say 1995 or so. During the course of the last decade, some things have occurred to really change that and to move us across the chasm. The first was the advent of the web. You know, I think back when I first interviewed with AIM, with the search committee in 1995, I was told two things by the search committee. Probably the two biggest lies I've ever been told by anybody, by the AIM search committee. The first one is they said, don't worry about web technologies. That's still a ways off. This is a client-server-based industry, and it's going to take a while before the web really permeates and penetrates what this industry is all about. The second is they said, you've got a great big giant trade show. Don't worry about that. That'll fund the organization forever and ever. The reality has turned out to be a lot different than that. Second thing that occurred in the last decade to move us across the chasm was an explosion of risk concerns on the part of end users. So it started with Enron, went into Sarbanes-Oxley, the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, countless permutations and combinations of legal and compliance and risk-based requirements that are placed on organizations that have driven a focus on control in organizations. And what that focus did was it basically forced us to think more comprehensively about what was going on. Third thing that happened, whether you like it, whether you hate it, whether you're ambivalent about it, is that Microsoft and SharePoint came into this space. And they came in first with Windows SharePoint Services, which everybody kind of said, you know, that's not really document management. Then they came in with MOS, and now they've come in with 2010. And so what it did basically was take an industry that had been focused on document specialists and basically started to expose those tools out there into the knowledge worker set. And that changed the industry quite fundamentally. User frustration, principally due to this point about risk concerns. All of a sudden people are saying, gosh, it's not cool anymore to have these disconnected silos. If I'm going to manage risk, I've got to get control over those silos. And in the process of doing that, users all of a sudden realized that this stuff was costing them way more than they expected, and it was way more complicated than they expected. And so that pushed initiatives like CMIS. If you haven't looked at that yet, it's the Content Management Interoperability Services Standard that has basically focused connection to different repositories from a seamless application. And then the last thing is you started to see was the rise of SaaS and open source kinds of options for people. So clearly our space has moved across that chasm, has moved into that green space where there's lots of money to be made, where there is lots of productivity gains to be gained on the part of end users, where there's lots of opportunity out there. And when you think about that space, we basically are calling that space systems of record. And there's a couple characteristics to that which I want to tee up as a counterpoise to what I'm going to talk about in a little bit with regards to social technologies. So some of the characteristics of this space of systems of record is that the focus is on command and control. The focus is on nailing things down and controlling information assets, particularly in the context of business transactions and business processes. That's really been the focus of what the last 15 years have been all about. Our industry is very document-centric. I'll talk about that in a second. We basically have bit off the assumption that we're going to have to train users on whatever system we deploy. And the emphasis has again been on nailing things down, knocking things down, trying to maintain control through security. That's what the space looks like right now, the traditional content management space underneath that big green curve of a mainstream market. So while all that's going on, there's also been a whole nother set of things going on that we mainly have experienced, not as employees, but as consumers. And so what you basically have is a revolution in consumer technologies that I think is going to sweep through our enterprises in terms of changing the expectations that we have for what technology means within our organizations. So when you think about it, essentially since Y2K, we've been on an evolutionary path with regards to these technologies. It might not feel like that. For those of you guys that have been in the trenches of implementing these solutions, it probably doesn't feel evolutionary. But in the vast scheme of things, it really has been compared to what's been going on the consumer side of the coin. The consumer space has been on fire. And so what has happened is that consumer technologies have touched more people in more ways and influenced more behavior in the last decade than probably in any other point in human history. And so what's happening in our organizations right now is that people are coming into them with this kind of a feeling, is that how can I be so powerful as a consumer of IT services and feel so lame as an employee? And this dynamic tension, when you think about it, I think is going to fundamentally shape what content management is moving forward. When you think about what we have done as an industry over the course of the last 15, 20 years, and what we've done in the broader enterprise space, if you want to think about it that way, essentially we've done two things, is that we have automated information flows up in the organization through things like ERP systems and content management systems and financial systems and audit systems and CRM systems and all of that. Simultaneously, we've cut cost out of the bottom of our organizations by digitizing and automating processes that were previously people-intensive and manual. Those are the two things that we've done with enterprise IT spending. In terms of the vast group of people in the middle, all these knowledge workers, what we've done is essentially we've given them bandwidth, we've given them a mobile phone, we've given them a laptop if they're lucky, we've given them the Office suite, we've given them email, and we've said, God bless, go out and collaborate and fundamentally transform the way you work. It's that missing place that where there's a lot of tension right now. And a lot of it, I think a lot of exciting things are going to happen. As you start to think about this revolution, you know, when we talk to people in the IT space, and part of this task force was to talk to 20 CIOs of leading end user organizations and ask them about some of these themes about what's going on, what's on their mind, what are they worried about, that kind of thing. How IT views this revolution is essentially captured in some of these statements. We want to continue with last decade's trend lines. We want to continue to build out our systems of record. There's still an awful lot of control work to do. And I've got more to do than I can handle right now, thank you very much. And by the way, you cut my budget over the course of the last 2 years. And so when you think about that, and then you think how do end users view this revolution, you have a real collision course in play. Users feel like this. We have lots of information technology, we just don't have any information. That's what it feels like to be a knowledge worker in most organizations right now. And what knowledge workers are doing is they're experiencing this kind of thing. They're basically going at what they experienced in the consumer space and saying, why can't I have this in the enterprise space? Why can't I have this within my organization? So for example, information on demand, kind of the Googleization of expectations on what it means to find information. You know, we've done countless surveys on this, and people always say it is way, way, way harder to find stuff inside the firewall than outside the firewall. That expectation is going to change in the next few years. They expect instant access, both in terms of being able to access their networks and information anywhere, as well as better information in terms of accessing their own people within their organization. You know, there's a quote that Tony Gingali, who's the CEO of Jive, uses to talk about social technologies, and he says, why is it that I know more about what my high school girlfriend had for dinner than what's going on within my own organization? That set of expectations is going to permeate through our organizations, particularly as the next generation of employees comes in. Mobile access. You know, we've had a revolution in mobile technologies over the course of the last 10 or 15 years. Basically, there are 4.6 billion cell phones out in the world right now. But we've only seen the tiny, tiny tip of the revolution. Basically, we've seen the revolution that occurs when you put telephony in everybody's pocket. Just wait to see what happens when we put computing platforms in everybody's pocket. And that's the revolution that we're in the middle of right now. Shad White's going to talk a little bit about this in terms of enterprise mobility and instant information everywhere and what that means in his keynote. And I think it's a critically important issue. If there's anything that's going to shape this space moving forward, is what does it mean when the primary source of interaction with our content repositories and with our business processes occurs on a mobile device rather than on a standalone desktop computer? That's what the future is going to bring. And then lastly, unconventional content. When you think about what we've experienced in the consumer realm. You know, who would have thought that video would have taken off in the way that it's taken off? So you put all those together, and you've got a real recipe, and it's more complicated because of this. If my IT department doesn't get it for me, I'll figure out a way to do it myself if I need to do my job. And that's really, really a revolutionary implication. A tiny story I heard at Enterprise 2.0 conference. A guy from Ford Motor Company talked about deployment of Facebook-like, Twitter-like activity streams within Ford. The way it was adopted, a couple of executives found a product called Yammer, which is a free product out there for enterprise Twitter applications. Those couple of executives sent it to a couple of their executives. Those executives sent it to a couple of their executives. Before the IT people even had discovered this was going on, 700 executives at Ford were using Yammer as their way of communicating about what was going on within the organization. Ultimately, the IT department decided to roll with that. Think about how revolutionary that is in terms of what this is all about. The other revolutionary aspect, and this slide comes from John Newton at Alfresco, is that we really have a left brain, right brain kind of phenomenon going on that I think is going to be challenging for us as an industry as we move forward. Because we tend to think on the side over there on the right-hand side of the coin, where we're all about control. People outside that are engaged in social technologies, they don't know what we're talking about, and vice versa. And that is going to be a challenge, I think, moving forward. So as you think about a future history of ECM, and what does this mean, and what are some of the implications of this, a couple of things to talk about just in terms of how systems of engagement, which is what I'm calling this whole social space, are different from systems of record. And to get us to think a little bit about how we figure out where these bridges are, back and forth, between unconventional content and conventional content. So where systems of record tend to be command and control focused, systems of engagement are collaborative in nature. Where the systems of record are transactionally focused, this is interaction and conversationally focused. Where it's document-centric, it's user-centric. Where we expect to train people, people expect to come to social systems and know how to do them in 5 minutes or they won't spend any more time on it. And basically, where you think about people that are online 365 by 24 by 7, using corporate assets to do that, this whole question of privacy and what's company, what's private becomes way, 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 way more complicated than just worrying about whether somebody's making long-distance calls from inside the office. And that set of issues, I think, is going to be increasingly complicated moving forward. So what you have here is a really interesting dynamic, I think, in terms of systems of engagement, because systems of engagement are communal by nature. But the artifacts that systems of engagement create aren't really enterprise content in the way that we've always thought about enterprise content. You know, ownership of these things is blurred, rights are ambiguous, authority is shared in these systems, governance is ambiguous, and so, you know, it doesn't really feel like what we've always gotten used to managing as people responsible for the information assets of our organizations. And yet they do need management, and they do need governance, and you can't just have a Wild West kind of situation. And so CIOs this is the kind of stuff they told us in our little task force when we talked to them. I'll just give you a second to read about it, but it basically says that nobody has figured this out yet. Everybody thinks there's a revolution coming. Everybody's trying to figure out how to get on top of it, and they haven't quite figured out how to do that. So what I thought I'd do with the rest of my time is spend time on these 3 questions. You know, first of all, what does control mean when you start to migrate into this world of systems of engagement? And then secondly, what kinds of use cases will make this whole systems of engagement stuff more meaningful to people moving forward? How do we get it to start to move across the chasm? How do we get it to connect up to systems of record so that we're looking at information holistically within our organizations? And then lastly, how should we start thinking about our business requirements, given this wacky world that we're going into, and given the fact that we basically have to walk and chew gum at the same time? We've got our core processes that we've got to manage, and we've got all this kind of wacky stuff on the side. So the first thing is just this question of control, I think, as reflected in that little Simpsons diagram from a few moments ago, is something that we've really got to think about collectively as an industry, as an association, as a community of end users. Because the concept of control that we've had within systems of record won't carry forward directly into the world of systems of engagement. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. There's a little mini case study. This is from the state of Texas. And this is basically going on in countless organizations around the country, where when they start to move down the path of thinking about social technologies and how they relate to their organization, they basically first start looking at public-facing sites and how can they figure out a way to use them for either constituency communication or customer communication. And the state of Texas is no different. And the only reason I'm picking on them and using them is I spoke to a Texas group a few days ago and pulled together some of this stuff. And so the state of Texas basically uses 5 publicly facing communication mechanisms to deal with external social media options. So the first one is Facebook. They have a Facebook page like many people have. They have a Flickr page where state employees as well as citizens in Texas are posting pictures. They have a YouTube site which they have used to communicate videos for, in this case, from the governor about hurricane expectations. They have a Twitter stream in which the Attorney General and the governor and all sorts of other people communicate out about what's going on in the state of Texas. And they also have a privately labeled site built on a site called getsatisfaction.com, which is essentially a constituent interaction site. A lot of companies use getsatisfaction.com with a private label and private veneer over the top of it to understand what their customers are thinking. So that's all well and good. You look at this and you say, okay, you know, this is an innovative organization that started to push the envelope in terms of utilization of social technologies. They're starting to get out there talking to people in the way that they're talking to each other. And that's all well and good. So I'm, you know, being kind of the nudge that I am, I started nosing around a little bit and looked at the terms and conditions associated with this site. And I came across this statement: social content on external sites will be archived and retained for the required period of time in accordance with the DIR records retention schedule. And I thought, that's kind of interesting to think about. So, of course, I found the Texas State Records Retention Schedule. I got to tell you, and I know a lot of you guys do this all the time, but if you ever have trouble going to sleep at night, get a copy of this kind of a document. It's a fabulous way to, you know, put yourself right under into a coma. And I found this with regards to communication. Non-administrative incoming, outgoing correspondence basically has to be kept for a year. So I started thinking about that, and I went back to the privately labeled getsatisfaction.com, texas.gov site, and I found this communication. Dear Sir, Madam, I am looking at starting a goat dairy farm. What licenses do I need, and where can I find the guidelines for inspection of the milking parlor and the associated regulations? I also found a response from a Texas official to this inquiry from a constituent. So relative to what I just talked about in terms of retention requirements for information that's based on external sites, it got me thinking about some questions that I'd be asking if I was in the state of Texas right now. And I would say, again, not to pick on the state of Texas, this is going on, at least in terms of our survey work, in 99 out of 100 organizations out there right now. Nobody's figured out how to do this. I would be asking questions like, do we need to keep this? How long do we need to keep this? How and when do I move it from the external site to some sort of controllable internal archive? Whose job is it to do this? And lastly, will this ever get done? And do we really care whether it gets done? And I think the point here that represents some of the things that we have to think about collectively within our community in terms of what control means in an environment in which people are going to be increasingly pushing these kinds of solutions out to their customers and constituencies, is that inevitably policy lags practice when it comes to technology implementations, law lags practice, regulation lags practice, and so you're going to be having this kind of stuff going on all the time in a very, very ambiguous legal and regulatory environment that people are going to have to start thinking about. And when you look at the kind of trouble that we've gotten into in the foreclosure mess that we have right now, it's basically because the technology ran ahead of the law. And nobody figured out that just because you were able to go down the path of automating some of those processes, if you had a regulatory requirement for a wet signature, it didn't go away. And so this environment of thinking through what are the implications, how do we redefine what control means in a world that is essentially uncontrollable? I don't mean to say this is an easy task. There is a certain amount of ambiguity that we are going to have to get used to because the volume of information that is beyond our control that we are creating and involved in implementing in our organizations is going to be staggering. And we've just got to figure out not how we control it, but maybe how we put a little bit of boundaries around it and a little bit of governance around it. Second thing I think that's going to be really important for us to do moving forward is to help our organizations think about where the links are between what we know well collectively, which is systems of record, and what's happening with systems of engagement. And I think, the awareness that we have out there is that things aren't really working all that well right now in the whole realm of systems of engagement. And this is pretty much what passes for collaboration in most organizations. The caption is, "Hi, my name is Barry, and I check my email 200 to 300 times a day." That's what passes for collaboration. That's what passes for social technologies in most organizations. And so when you think about what's going to happen to some key processes in our organizations as these technologies sweep through in the next 5 years, I think it's helpful to think about who some of the key players are, what are the things they care about, what are the value chains that they're responsible for, and how are social technologies going to change those processes, and how do they need to be linked back up to what we all know how to do collectively. And so some of the things I think we need to think about with regards to this. If you're the CMO in an organization, the process, the value chain that you care about is how do you market, how you sell, and how you support. That has a lot of sub-processes associated with it. All of those things are going to be affected by social technologies. All of those things can't be done with social technologies alone. They've got to be linked back up to the back-end customer information. And nobody knows how to do that right now. The CFO cares about how do you source things, how do you buy things, how do you deploy things. And again, that whole interaction, particularly with external supply chains, is going to change in the next few years. It's going to change for the better if we can figure out how we link it back into the information that we already have in our organization so that they don't just operate independently. If you're the CTO, you're responsible for bringing new products to market. You're responsible for processes that basically are involved in designing products, building products, and delivering products. And this really represents an area, I think, that has so much opportunity right now for our space. If we can think about how we define the use case associated with project management in organizations that basically taps into the strength of the communication tools that exist on the social side and the back-end information that we have about projects on the document repository and content repository side, there is a rich new set of processes that we can drive through our organizations that have significant bottom line advantage to our organizations. And lastly, if you're the CIO, you're responsible for things like planning technology, provisioning, and reporting back. And this question of mobile technologies and how you deploy mobile technologies and what's the use case for mobile technologies and what does it mean when you can do things like, for example, on those Chase commercials, sit in bed and scan a check into your bank in the consumer context. What does that mean in a business context? What does that mean in terms of increasing the velocity that you potentially have out there in terms of your business processes? What does it mean in terms of putting those kinds of tools in people's hands and that kind of thing? So I think this is going to be really important in the next few years. I think the organizations that figure out these use cases, and nobody's figured this out really well right now, the organizations that figure this out are going to be the ones that are going to leapfrog their competitors over the course of the next few years. So the last thing that I wanted to chat with you about is this whole question of business requirements. Maybe just give you some things to think about as you scope out your projects, as you think about these projects, because simultaneously, while I'm talking about all this cool, crazy new stuff that exists over on the social side, we've got work to do, we've got business to do, we've got money to make in that mainstream content management market that is clearly underneath the curve. And we've got to figure out how we tap that, how we walk and chew gum at the same time with regards to being sensitive to what's going on on the edges, but conscious of the job that we need to do in the mainstream. And so a couple things I wanted to talk about here. The first one is I think we've got to be conscious of what kind of technology we're trying to implement. And how does the implementation pattern for that technology vary depending on where it is on this old Jeff Moore curve. If you're looking to implement an imaging system, you need to approach that differently from a sell side, whether you're doing an internal sale or whether you're doing an external sale into an organization, than if you're trying to sell a Yammer-like social networking tool into an organization. Different constituencies, different price points, different customers. So my first thing I think that we need to think about is be conscious of what kind of technology. It's a broad spectrum right now. What exactly are you trying to do from a business perspective? How does that map into the relevant technology set? And then be conscious of where you are on the curve, whether you're on the bleeding edges or whether you're in the mainstream middle, because that'll affect what you can demand of the vendor community, frankly. Second thing I think you need to be conscious of is think about this whole question of maturity within a particular technology space or within a particular technology competency. And I wanted to share with you just a little bit of data from a survey that we haven't released yet, which is a capture survey that will be coming out in the next month or so. And I think it highlights within the capture space, but it's extendable into the more universal content management space, the need to know where your organization is in maturity terms with regards to these technologies. So the question we asked end users in this survey was, what is the highest state of maturity that you've reached in your organization with regards to capture and scanning technologies? And these are the answers they came back with. First of all, 3%, we don't scan anything. 15%, we use scanners, but not in any organized way. 34%, we scan as image only, and we manually apply metadata to an archive. Well, first of all, ding, 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 if you're on the vendor side, keep in mind this is an AIM crowd, and 50% say they're basically not using scanning in a meaningful way right now, in terms of how we would define meaning. That's a lot of business opportunity out there to think about. 15% say we scan and capture metadata for archiving and routing. 17% say we scan and OCR for full text search, kind of going up the hierarchy of maturity in terms of scanning technologies. You might notice that there's 16% missing. The 16%, that only leaves 16% of the people that we surveyed that say we used fixed or semi-structured forms to extract data to drive process. So again, lots of opportunity. We think this is a mature market. It is a mature set of technologies, but it is not a mature market. There is an awful lot of opportunity that's untapped out there in organizations. The other point is that if you need to really think through as you define your business requirements for projects, do you have this kind of expertise in terms of knowing how to extract data off of forms to drive business processes, or are you basically just trying to replace file cabinets? Whichever it is, you need to know where you are on that curve in order to define business requirements that reflect what it is that you're trying to do. Third thing I think we need to be really clear about is understand why you are doing what you are doing. Understand it not in technology terms, but in the context of your business processes. This again is from that capture survey that we haven't released yet. And what we basically did is we said, tell us a little bit about why you are looking at capture and scanning technologies. What are the top 3 drivers that you have in your organization? And if you go through and you put the data attached to this, the top 3 basically come back as improving process throughput, improving information access, kind of a KM kind of argument to scanning, and 43, reducing physical office costs. That's about what I would have expected with regards to scanning and capture. But I think the thing to think about along the way is that these are way different things. And you've got to be clear which of those you're trying to accomplish from a business objective. Because if you're trying to improve information access and improve kind of things from a KM perspective, that's a lot different than just reducing physical office space. You get both along the way, but one has to be more important than the other in order to think about what the strategy is that's appropriate to your organization. This is capture specific, but it applies to the broader space as well. The fourth thing I think we need to be conscious of is understanding who calls the shots. This again is from that same survey. Down the side here, what you see is a set of technologies. Across the top, you see a set of decision makers. Who makes the decision? This is critically important when you're selling outside into an organization, but it's also critically important in figuring out how you position your projects internally. Because if you're doing a SharePoint project, just to pick one out of the air, it's pretty clear on this who you ought to be talking to. Simultaneously, if you're doing a capture project, it's a little bit more ambiguous in terms of who you speak with. The fifth thing I want to talk about is to try and get people to think about this, and I run across this all the time in our roadshow that we do, is that people seem to think there is a, whoa, is my time up? I haven't done anything different. There we go. People seem to think that there is a right solution. There is not a right solution. There is only an appropriate solution to what you are trying to do. And I think, this really became clear to me on a survey that we did relative to SharePoint. And it really drove home for me that there are a lot of different ways to look at the world. This one is SharePoint specific, but it really relates to just about anything, is that there's a lot of technology out there. The technology is not the point. The point is, what are you trying to do with it in a business context? And so we asked people, how are you using SharePoint with regards to other ECM solutions in your organization? And these were people that had deployed SharePoint. So that was kind of the data set, if you will. 5% said it works in competition with the other ECM players. 23% said it works in parallel with other systems. 20% said it's integrated with other ECM systems. 11% said it is our ECM system, and 30% says it fills in some functions. The point of this isn't a SharePoint point. The point of this is that these are very, very different perspectives that are based on what it is that you are trying to accomplish with the technology. So as you think about your business requirements, think about it not so much in terms of the technology. Don't be rushed into vendor roulette faster than you're comfortable in being rushed into vendor roulette. Think about your business requirements from a business perspective and let that drive the technology rather than the other way around. The last thing I wanted to just touch on is understand the obstacles that you're likely to encounter. This is from a survey that we did that essentially asked people to rank the top 3 obstacles that they encountered along the way. These were people that had deployed content and records and information management systems along the way. You can see the options that we gave them. The answers basically came back like this, in the same order that I had them on this slide. And the thing I think that's important to understand here as you design your business requirements is understand the obstacles that you are going to encounter and plan for them along the way. Understand that the obstacles you are likely to encounter don't have anything to do with the technology. Somebody at one point said that in this space, what's soft is hard and what's hard is soft. And I think that's very, very true as you think about your business requirements. When we find out, projects that went awry, it almost always went awry not because of the technology, but because the softer things weren't handled on the front end. The change management issues weren't addressed on the front end. The training issues weren't addressed on the front end. And I think I was really excited to see Dr. Brown's presentation scheduled for tomorrow on change management. His subtitle is The Secret Ingredient for Success, and it couldn't be more appropriate as you think about, in these very, very changing times, how you go about designing your systems and making your information choices and designing your business requirements along the way. So the last thing I wanted to leave you with is that it seems like a crazy world out there. It seems like we're being asked to work 365 by 24 by 7, and in some ways we really are. And if it provides any solace at all, we have not yet been asked to deploy this kind of technology, which I think, this is, I think, what my board would ultimately like me to have. And that way I would never have to leave the office. I would never have to leave my workstation. And so as you think about this, I think the industry that we are morphing into has enormous opportunity in the mainstream content management space. Again, if I could leave you with one thought, think about the fact that this is a mature technology, but it is an immature market. There are lots of opportunities out there. There are lots of processes that haven't been automated yet. And at the same time, there's this other kind of crazy thing over in the corner that ultimately is going to shape how we look at content management into the years ahead. So thank you all very much for your time. Have a terrific conference. Enjoy the next couple of days. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. One more time for John Mancini.